The Great War had a larger impact on the lives of ordinary British citizens than any conflict since the English Civil War of the 15th century. Massive numbers of young men were recruited, supplies were rationed, and women had to take jobs at the factories newly opened to produce military supplies. On top of these strains, the war would prove to be the bloodiest in British history, and by war's end, over 700,000 British servicemen had died in the trenches of the Western Front. In order to preserve civilian morale and support for the war, the British government launched an unprecedented propaganda effort that stretched across radio, film, newspapers, magazines, and posters. Although all of these efforts were effective, none were as fascinating as the English government's coordination with fiction writers to produce more subtle forms of propaganda. This coordination existed almost from the beginning of the propaganda machine itself. In August of 1914, the British government created the War Propaganda Bureau, and they appointed Charles Masterman, an author, former editor, and politician, to head it. On September 2, 1914, only a few weeks after the Bureau's inception, Masterman summoned around 24 prominent authors including Thomas Hardy, James Barrie, H.G. Wells, and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle to his offices. There he asked them to pledge support for the war effort and to produce propaganda pieces for the government. Wells and many others wrote pamphlets supporting the war effort and attempting to maintain the patriotism and morale of the civilian population as it began to brace under the rising costs of this seemingly senseless war. Conan Doyle brought Sherlock Holmes out of retirement for a story called His Last Bow, in which Holmes and Watson break up a German spy ring in pre-war Britain, and in the famous East Wind speech, prophesies that the coming war will have a cleansing and regenerative effect on British society. Rudyard Kipling began the war by emphasizing the manly duty that British youths had to fight, asking, "What will be the position in years to come of the young man who has deliberately elected to outcast himself from this all-embracing brotherhood?" His writing took a decidedly darker turn after his own son John was killed in action. In Mary Postgate, his most famous story from the war, an elderly widow burns a downed German airman to death on a bonfire made from the possessions of her recently deceased son. However, none of these could compare to John Buchan. Buchan began the war in relative obscurity. However, in 1914 he was commissioned to write its official history. He would go on to publish 24 volumes totaling over 1,000,000 words. His histories were notoriously unreliable, going so far as to say that the British had achieved every desired objective at the Somme, but they were all bestsellers. During this time, Buchan's career as a novelist began to take off as well, and he published at least one patriotic thriller every year over the course of the war. In addition to all of this, Buchan was a frontline journalist, commissioned lieutenant in the Intelligence Corps, and was eventually appointed Director of Information, a post that was responsible for organizing press and propaganda efforts, and reported directly to the Prime Minister. Though not a particularly good writer, he was an amazingly prolific one, and his contribution to the British propaganda effort was second only to Masterman's. It was not only women, factory workers, and young men who were mobilized for the British war effort, but even the nation's novelists and authors. The British government skillfully used their talents to drum up and maintain public support for the war.